Okay. Now this morning we begin what, Lord willing, will be a lengthy journey through the Gospel according to John. This is the first time in my more than 30 years of teaching the Bible that I have taught this book. And that's, if you're familiar with the book, if you spend any time in the Gospel of John, you know that there's some difficult sledding in the Gospel of John. There are many places that require much wrestling to hear the message of the Spirit. Now, I read John, of course, many times through my life and have studied sections of it. But in 2021, I had the opportunity, or made the opportunity, to spend about 4.5 months in intense study of the entire book. And so I'm hoping that I have something worth sharing with you. If I succeed in communicating only a fraction of the theological riches in the Gospel according to John, your time in the class will be well spent. As you know, if you've spent time there, not only is it difficult sledding, but you also know that it's an absolutely amazing revelation of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. So I just hope that I can accurately, faithfully communicate to you what the Spirit is teaching us in this book. Now this morning, and maybe for part of next week, I'm going to do as I always do when I'm starting a book, I want to do some introductory matters. I may spill over into next week, but we'll have to see about that. And I want to start with the authorship, of course. You say, well, it's the Gospel of John. Why spend time on that? Well, why do you think that? You see, it's useful to you in dealing in a world for somebody to say, is there any reason to think that? Or did you just decide that because you want this book to be written by an apostle, so you just declared it and there's no reason and you're a moron for thinking that? Is that the case? Or are there actually reasons for thinking that John? You know, there are plenty of reasons. So I want to arm you with some of those and explain them to you. The author of the gospel is identified in John 21, verse 20 and 24, taken together. He's identified there as the disciple whom Jesus loved. Now there are people, many people, who say, no. That's not, the author is not referring to himself that way in John 21. He's not referring to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved, because that would be an exclusivist way. A Christian writer wouldn't say that. He wouldn't refer to himself, the disciple whom Jesus loved, and he doesn't love the others. You see, they claim that that's an exclusivist reading and that a Christian author would more likely refer to somebody else as the disciple whom Jesus loved. But that's a misunderstanding, really, of what's going on in the Christian faith. As Carson and Moo explain, they say when a New Testament writer thinks of himself as someone whom Jesus loves, it is never to suggest that other believers are not loved or are somehow loved, lest the suggestion betrays a profound ignorance of the psychological dynamics of Christian experience. Those who are most profoundly aware of their own sin and need, and who in consequence most deeply feel the wonders of the grace of God that has reached out and saved them, even then, are those who are most likely to talk about themselves as the objects of God's love in Christ Jesus. If a son of thunder has become the apostle of love, small wonder he thinks of himself as the peculiar object of the love of Jesus. But that is scarcely a mark of arrogance. It is rather the mark of brokenness. And I think that's right. And Carson and Moo go on to say the same sort of reasoning probably explains why the evangelist does not name himself. John is not named in the gospel. There are a lot of disciples who are named, but John is not named. Now, why? If John's writing it, why doesn't John name himself? And it's the same psychology. It is this desire to reflect away from oneself to the object of glorification, the one who has rescued this sinner. And they say here, the same sort of reasoning probably explains why the evangelist does not name himself. He prefers to refer to himself obliquely, indirectly, the better to focus on the one he serves. To achieve his purpose in writing, he does not need to stand explicitly on his apostolic dignity. He is already well known by his intended readership. You see, that reasoning for saying, well, John wrote it, but John had his reasons in his humility for not identifying himself, not naming himself expressly in the gospel. People say, well, I don't really know if that makes... No, that makes sense. It's certainly easier to believe that than to believe somebody else is writing the Gospel of John, naming all of these other disciples and not naming John. Right? I mean, it's easier to think it's John who's doing it, who has his own reasons in humility for not naming himself, than to think somebody else is doing it and they're skipping John. Why would somebody else do that? Now, we know in John, so you say, okay, so the disciple whom Jesus loved is identified as the author. Well, what can we know about the disciple whom Jesus loved? And we can see that in John 13:23 and in 21:20, that this disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, he was present at the Last Supper. That's significant because we know in Matthew 26:20, Mark 14:17, Luke 22:14, that Jesus ate the Last Supper with his 12 apostles. So the disciple whom Jesus loved was present at the Last Supper. The Last Supper was eaten with the 12 apostles, so we then know that the disciple whom Jesus loved is one of the 12 apostles. We're narrowing down. We're closing in on it. And we also know that the disciple whom Jesus loved, we know that he's not Peter. He is expressly distinguished from Peter. The disciple whom Jesus loved is mentioned in 5 places. 4 of those places, he is mentioned in association with Peter, but distinguished from Peter. Okay, so we know he's not Peter, but almost invariably when he's mentioned, he's with Peter. Now, why is that significant? Well, there are a number of texts that suggest to us that Peter, James, and John, I got to keep turning around to make sure it clicks. There are a number of texts that suggest to us that Peter, James, and John constituted a kind of inner circle among the apostles. They're all apostles, and I understand that. But when you look at these kinds of texts I have up there, there's a sense in which Peter, James, and John are an inner circle, this inner trio. And so we look and we say that the disciple whom Jesus loved is almost invariably, 4 out of the 5 times he's mentioned, it's in association with Peter. So the fact that Peter, James, and John form an inner circle, that favors the notion that the disciple whom Jesus loved was either James or John, the inner circle, because he's so routinely mentioned with Peter. So you say, okay, well, that makes sense. It favors that the disciple whom Jesus loved is James or John, one of the sons of Zebedee. Well, James was executed by Herod Agrippa in the early 40s. You can see in Acts chapter 12, verse 2. So he's not a realistic possibility for being the author. So that leaves John, the son of Zebedee. And in the Gospel of John, chapter 21, verse 2, the 7 disciples who are together there in John 21:2, those 7 disciples include the sons of Zebedee. Okay, so we've got 7 disciples. Those 7 include the sons of Zebedee. And as Edward Klink says, he says since chapter 21, verse 7 mentions the presence of the beloved disciples. So 21:2, we've got 7 including the sons of Zebedee. 21:7, we have the beloved disciple mentioned there in verse 7. Klink says, since 21:7 mentions the presence of the beloved disciples, he's certainly to be included among the 7 disciples mentioned in 21:2, and is almost certainly one of the 2 unnamed disciples who are the sons of Zebedee, mentioned only here in the Gospel of John. Okay, so again, we have a tie now again. The beloved disciple being one of the sons of Zebedee. Okay? And it's that you've got James and John, the sons of Zebedee. James couldn't write it because it's written after James has been executed. Now, John, the son of Zebedee, as the author, you say, well, all right, if John, the apostle John, the son of Zebedee, is the author, does that fit with things that we see in the gospel? And it does. It fits very nicely with the things that we see in the gospel. You see, it's consistent with the fact that who wrote the gospel of John, that person is familiar with Galilee, Samaria, Judea. You can see in those texts, he's familiar with the city of Jerusalem. He's familiar with the temple. So that's what you would expect from a Palestinian Jew. He knows the city. He knows these things. So that's consistent with authorship by John, the son of Zebedee, the apostle John. Barry Smith, he says, the author is acquainted with the social and religious conditions of Palestine. Likewise, he's also familiar with Jewish and Samaritan religious beliefs, and he's well acquainted with how Jewish festivals were celebrated at the temple and with purification rites, Passover, tabernacles, dedication, purification rites. He says, to have such detailed knowledge of the social and religious conditions of Palestine and Jewish and Samaritan religious beliefs implies the author had firsthand experience of Jews and Samaritans, which suggests that he's from Palestine. His good knowledge of the temple and Jewish festivals implies that he was a participant in the various Jewish festivals, which suggests he was a Palestinian Jew. His knowledge of Jewish purification rites is consistent with firsthand experience. So we have all of these things, the internal evidence. When you speak of internal evidence, when you're trying to piece together, okay, who wrote something? You look inside the writing itself. That's called the internal evidence. And can we, from inside the book itself, derive who wrote it? And so what I've just given you is the internal evidence. The book itself suggests that the author is John, the son of Zebedee, the apostle John. Well, what about external evidence? Is there any evidence outside the book, outside the gospel according to John, or outside the Bible that confirms or corroborates that, yes, what the internal evidence is saying to us, that John is the author? Do we have corroboration from something outside the book? And we do, in fact. Irenaeus, make sure Irenaeus comes up. Okay, Irenaeus, in a work he wrote called Against Heresies. Irenaeus is a Christian author, scholar. He writes around AD 180 a work called Against Heresies, and he attributes in that work, he attributes the gospel to the Apostle John, as do the late 2nd century writings known as the Muratorian Canon and the Anti-Marcionite Prologue. Now, Irenaeus' testimony is particularly significant because Eusebius, you know who Eusebius is? He was a theologian, and he wrote the first history of the church. He's in the late 3rd, early 4th century. He wrote a number of editions of the history of the church, his last being around 325. Okay, so he's late 3rd, early 4th century. Eusebius says that Irenaeus, who wrote Against Heresies in 180, so later Eusebius writes History of the Church, and he says Irenaeus' understanding that this gospel was written by the Apostle John, he got that from Polycarp. And Polycarp, who was martyred at the age of 86 in AD 156, Polycarp says he got that information about who wrote the gospel from the apostles. Irenaeus knew Polycarp as a child. So, we have Irenaeus says, looks like a really good chain. That he says, no, the gospel was written by the Apostle John. That information, according to Eusebius, came from Polycarp, who got it from the apostles. So that's pretty solid there. And other notable early church figures who recognized the Apostle John as the author, include Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, and also Eusebius. And C.H. Dodd, a scholar, he says about Eusebius's testimony, he says it's significant that Eusebius, who had access to many works that are now lost. Right? I mean, he's writing at the end of the 3rd, beginning of the 4th century, doing his history of the church over a number of editions. And he's out collecting stuff, and he's a theologian, a scholar. He knows a great deal about the early church. But a lot of his sources have since disappeared. You know, they're just vanished. That's how it happens when you're talking over hundreds of years. But he had access to many things, so it's quite significant. And as Dodd says, it's significant that he had access to many works that are now lost. He speaks without reserve of the 4th gospel as the unquestioned work of St. John. And then D.A. Carson and Douglas Moo, in their introduction to the New Testament, they echo how important that is that Eusebius accepts this, because he says the silence is most significant. Eusebius' silence, that Eusebius doesn't say there was some question or some issue about who wrote the Gospel of John. That Eusebius doesn't say that is significant precisely because it was Eusebius' concern to discuss doubtful cases. So he's particularly interested in cases of doubtful or questioned authorship, and he wants to get to the bottom of who wrote what, and he fully accepts this. He doesn't even consider this a case where there's any question about it. So that's very powerful and significant. And then we have all of the ancient Greek manuscripts. I didn't know if I should put this in internal testimony or external, right? Because there's a sense in which the title of the gospel is part of the gospel. It's on the manuscript. But I put it here, but I at least note the difficulty in where to position this piece of evidence. But all of the ancient Greek manuscripts of the gospel according to John, they all include the title which identifies John as the author. And in fact, the oldest of these, which is known as P66, Papyrus 66, it dates to the late 2nd century. That's very early. We have a manuscript, okay, that dates to the late 2nd century. Now, that manuscript is only a tiny fragment of the gospel. P66 is just a tiny fragment of the Gospel of John, but it includes the first page. It includes the first page, which reads, "The Gospel according to John." And John is likewise, he's identified as the author in Papyrus 75, which is the 2nd to 3rd century, and in these codexes. A codex is simply a book, okay? You got a scroll, and then Christians were very fond of book form, codexes. So it's like you have pages out of a book, with these great codexes of the 4th and 5th century. All of them identify John. Okay, there are none that don't. And so I say, so that clearly that's a reflection, you see, of the understanding of who wrote it. Well, Andreas Kostenberger, L. Scott Kellum, and Charles Quarles, and it's an introduction to the New Testament. It's titled "The Cradle, the Cross, and the Crown." They say, all right, there they are. It says, therefore, this is how they conclude their examination of the authorship issue. And these scholars, in their introduction, they say, therefore, a close examination of all the available internal and external evidence provides plausible grounds for the following 3 conclusions about the authorship of John's Gospel. 1, the author is an apostle and eyewitness. He's one of the 12. He is John, the son of Zebedee, the strongest candidate on the basis of the above adduced internal and external evidence. While the hypothesis of the apostolic authorship of the 4th Gospel is regularly the object of derision in recent Johannine scholarship, the hypothesis has never been decisively refuted and continues to be at least as plausible as alternative explanations. Okay? To me, it's clear. This is a writing of the Apostle John. Okay? So the author is John. That's why I think that. Okay? There are reasons for thinking that. And I've tried to share those with you. Now, well, what about the date? When is John written? Can we learn anything about that? Well, that the apostle lived a long life, that the apostle John lived a long life. That's implied in John chapter 21, verse 23, which reveals there was a widespread rumor. You know this. It reveals there was this widespread rumor among Christians that Jesus had indicated that the apostle John would not die. Okay? Well, how would such a rumor get started? Well, that implies he lived a really long time. You see, he's an old guy. People go, man, this guy's really old. Well, Jesus said he would never die. Okay, so there's that implication there. A long life would have fueled that rumor among Christians. And then Irenaeus, who's in the late 2nd century, Clement of Alexandria, late 2nd, early 3rd, Hippolytus in the late 2nd, early 3rd, Eusebius in the early 4th, and Jerome in the late 4th and early 5th, they all indicate that John's exile on Patmos. You remember in Revelation chapter 1, verse 9, we see that the apostle John, to whom the revelation is given there, Revelation chapter 1, verse 9, John has been exiled to the island of Patmos, which is how Romans sometimes treated people. But we see from all of these early writers that John's exile occurred during the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian. Now, Domitian reigned from AD 81 to 96. That's when John is exiled to the island of Patmos. Now, these same church fathers, they report that John returned to Ephesus. So he's, if I can get to, where's the there it is. So he's exiled to this island of Patmos. And then those same early Christian writers say that after Domitian's death in 96, John returned to Ephesus. And John then died shortly into the reign of the Roman Emperor Trajan. So Domitian dies in 96, Trajan begins to reign in 98. And shortly into Trajan's reign, you have John dies. Okay, so that sets the limit. When can it be written? It can't be written after that. John wrote it, and if he's dead, say by 100 or 99, well then it can't be written after that. So that kind of sets the limit there on what's the latest date it could have been written. Now in 1920, a man named Bernard Grenfell, he acquired in Egypt a small fragment about 3.5 inches by 2.5 inches of a papyrus codex. So he got a page of a book, a fragment of a page of a book, a papyrus book. And the front of that, it has parts of John chapter 18, verses 31 to 33, and the other side of the page, because books are on both written on both sides. So 18, 31 to 33 on the front, and on the back you have parts of chapter 18, verse 37 and 38. Now that little fragment is known as the Rylands Papyrus, or P52, and it's on display in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, England. And so based on the style of the writing of that little fragment, you have people who study these things. And so based on how the Greek writing is done on that papyrus, they believe that this papyrus dates from, it was written in the first half of the 2nd century. So from 100 to 150. Somewhere in there is the gauge of, based on this subjective assessment of the handwriting, the style of writing, that's what you would see. So that's a very early fragment, right? So even if somebody rejects the authorship of the Apostle John, if somebody wants to say, yeah, I hear all this stuff you're saying, but I'm not buying that John wrote it. Even if they reject that, you still have to realize that this gospel could not have been written very late into the 2nd century because there had to be enough papyrus copies circulating in Egypt to make it plausible for this fragment to survive from the first half of the first century. So you got it, John in Ephesus, you've got to have enough copies going out, getting to Egypt, and to be produced in enough numbers that it's reasonable to think that a fragment would survive. So you can't go very far into the second century, even if you say, I don't believe John wrote it. Okay, it's an early thing. Now, though a few scholars argue that John was written before 70, it's common for evangelical scholars to date the gospel into the 80s or 90s. For example, I've just given you a number of them up here. Carson and Moo, in their introduction, they tentatively give a date of 80 to 85. You have Kostenberger, Kellerman, Quarles, mid-80s to early 90s. Craig Blomberg, 80s or 90s. Okay, that's pretty much where they are. And these are just educated guesses. You say, well, why the variation? They're educated guesses based on differing assessments of bits of data. And if you want to go mine the bits of data, you can get these books and go through, because they go through and say, this is why we think this and think that. So they're subjective judgment. That's why you get a span. But typically, evangelical scholars they date the Gospel of John in the 80s or 90s. Well, where was it written? Okay, do we know anything about where it was written? Well, early patristic testimony, early Christian writers indicate that the Gospel of John was written in Ephesus. Carson and Moo, they say in their introduction, they say, the traditional view is that the fourth Gospel was written in Ephesus. In large part, this view depends on the weight given to the uniform but sometimes difficult patristic evidence. Eusebius says that Asia, i.e. Asia Minor, approximately the western third of modern Turkey, Eusebius says that Asia was allotted to John when the apostles were dispersed at the outbreak of the Jewish War. The Jewish War is from 66 to 70. Now, some of the allotments and assignments that Eusebius lists are likely legendary. In other words, they're likely false. So that's what complicates things. There are some that don't seem as credible as others. But he says, but perhaps this one is reliable since it agrees with other sources. For example, Irenaeus, who early in 180, Irenaeus, who says that John, the disciple of the Lord, published the gospel while living at Ephesus in Asia. Okay, so it looks like he's writing this in Ephesus. And he spent time there because he's exiled to Patmos. So that makes sense. And as previously mentioned, the church fathers, they report that John was exiled to Patmos from Revelation 1:9. He was exiled there during Domitian's reign. And he returned to Ephesus after Domitian's death in 96 and then died shortly into the reign of Trajan. The vision of Revelation, we know that was given to him during his time on Patmos. What we don't know is if he's writing from Ephesus, did he write the Gospel of John before he was exiled to Patmos? Or did he write it after he returned from exile to Patmos? Okay, can't be sure about that. But this is why you get some of the range of dating there. Well, what's the purpose? Why is John writing this gospel? Okay, and we see in John chapter 21, verse 30 to 31, it says, it says, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. And I'll say a little bit about that in a minute. But these are written so that you may believe, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Now, I share Grant Osborne's interpretation of this purpose statement. What is he saying in this purpose statement? And I think Osborne gets it right when he says some, and he's referring here to Leon Morris, and he says D.A. Carson especially. He says, some believe John wrote primarily to evangelize Jews. There are other scholars like Brown, Kaiser, Michaels, Ritterboss. They think he wrote mainly for believers. This is certainly a false dichotomy. I'm not convinced by either extreme. Rather, John wrote both to awaken faith in the lost and to quicken faith in the followers of Jesus. So Bruce, Beasley, Murray, Whitaker, Burge. John wanted to win the lost as well as strengthen believers. I think that's what John is doing. Okay, I think he has a twofold purpose there. And this dual purpose, it would have been accomplished, you see, by directing the gospel to the church. He writes the gospel to be taken up and circulated in the church to get to achieve both of those goals. According to Kostenberger, Kellum, and Quarles, they say it seems that John's purpose encompassed both aspects. So agreeing with Osborne and what I think is the right take there, they said it seems John's purpose encompassed both aspects: evangelism of unbelievers and edification of believers, strengthening. You see, building your faith. So both of those things, and that John pursued an indirect evangelistic purpose aiming to reach an unbelieving audience through the Christian readers of his gospel. See, the testimony, the gospel, he sends it out and it circulates within the church, and there, in that way it would become the basis of outreach to others. So he sends it out, it circulates within the church, building and strengthening them, and then from that, it then becomes the basis of reaching out. But first into the church, that just makes sense. Who's going to be interested? Who's going to pick it up? Who's going to run with it? It's going to be the church, and then it's reflected out and becomes a basis of evangelism. And I think that's how to see it and what's going on. Well, what's the relationship between John and the synoptic gospels? Okay, you know the synoptic gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And if they're called synoptic, it just means it refers to the fact that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a significant degree of similarity. Right? If you've read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you know that. They have a significant degree of similarity. They, in places, have identical wording. Okay, absolutely, completely identical wording in certain places, and yet they also have significant differences in content, in wording, and in order. So there clearly seems to be, because you have identical wording in places, and yet you have this variation in content and wording and order, there clearly seems to be some kind of literary relationship between the synoptics, between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Some kind of sharing of written material. Okay, there clearly seems to be so that we have people here who are drawing on a common source. Some kind of sharing of that. But the nature of that relationship is unclear. It's quite a puzzle. Trying to say, listen, it looks clearly like there's a literary relationship. There is a sharing of written sources. But can we go back and through investigation and detective work, can we ferret out how that played out? And it's difficult. It's a very different. This is what is known as, in biblical studies, this is what is known as the synoptic problem. Okay, but it's not really a problem. It's more of a puzzle. Okay, trying to figure out what are the relationships here, and it's been the subject of intense scholarly study. Trying to get to the bottom. What can we learn about the relationships here? Now, most scholars today are convinced that the Gospel of Mark was the first of the four Gospels to be written. And they think that in composing their Gospels, that Matthew and Luke had access to Mark, and both Matthew and Luke drew from Mark, but they also had access to another set, what scholars call Q, and that they both drew from that document or source, and then they each had their own individual sources. Here's what this looks like. This is called I'm not going to go into this, but the four-source theory. All right, this is pretty much mainstream scholarly understanding of the origin of the synoptics. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't people who disagree. Some people deny that Mark came first. They put Matthew there. Some people deny that Q exists. Okay, I know that. But I'm just giving you, this is pretty much mainstream type stuff. So you have, see, Mark first, Matthew and Luke draw from Mark. This source that's debated, Q, Matthew and Mark draw from there, and then Matthew has his own source and Luke has his own source. Okay? Now when you talk about literary relationships and people drawing from sources, I always like you to remember, when you do that, people say, well, wait a minute, I thought God is inspiring this. What are you talking about sources? There's no... Using sources is not incompatible with inspiration, right? Luke, as I've said many times, in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, he notes the existence of prior accounts, right? He knows the existence of prior accounts, and he implies his use of those existing prior accounts in writing his own gospel. And see, inspiration doesn't mean that a person sits here and simply writes, automatic writing what God pours into their ear. It is more complex than that oftentimes. And what it means is that God is so great that he superintended the entire process so that whatever was out there that Luke was drawing on and winds up getting and producing, whatever Luke produced was exactly what God wanted produced. He superintended the entire process. Okay? So when you talk about sources, people get nervous and they say, well, that's what I want you to see. It's not inconsistent with inspiration in the least. It's just maybe with a certain type of inspiration, and I'm saying if that's your type of inspiration, if you limit inspiration to that, you're underselling God. You're not recognizing how great he is in his ability to orchestrate and to oversee and superintend processes that are so complicated that you and I would say no one in that situation could guarantee that what came out was exactly what they wanted. I say, God can. Okay? God can, and that's what he winds up doing there. All right, the gospel according to John, as you know, is quite different from the synoptic gospels. Okay, quite different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It includes material about Jesus that is not found in the synoptic gospels. And it excludes material that is found in the synoptic gospels. Here are two charts I want to run through with you quickly that were prepared by a New Testament scholar named Mark Powell. And it says here some stories that are unique to John. In other words, they are not in the synoptic gospels. You see here calling of Andrew, Philip, and Nathanael, changing of water into wine, conversation with Nicodemus, the encounter with a Samaritan woman at a well, healing of a crippled man at the pool of Bethesda, the rescue of an adulterous woman from stoning. But as I say, that's not in the original of the Gospel of John. Okay, I'll tell you that when we get to it. Healing of a man born blind, the raising of Lazarus, washing of the disciples' feet, prayer for believers to be united, resurrection appearance to Thomas. These things are unique to John. And then on the other hand, we have things that are absent from John that are present in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. For example, no stories of Jesus' birth, no mention of Jesus' baptism, nothing about Jesus being tempted or tested by Satan, no mention of Jesus eating with tax collectors and sinners, no transfiguration, no parables, exorcisms, no condemnation of the rich or words about helping the poor, nothing about loving one's neighbor, no call for people to repent, no call for disciples to deny themselves or renounce their possessions, no predictions of Jerusalem's downfall, no mentions of Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper, almost no mention of the kingdom, almost no references to the second coming. I say, but you know this from reading them, right? If you've read the Gospels with any attention or awareness, you know that there's something. That's why these three are called synoptic, and this one's not. You see, because these have significant commonality, and this one has some commonality, but it also has some differences. So you have those there. Now, John and the synoptics also have a different geographical focus. Not only do you have, it includes some things, they don't exclude some things, they do. There's also a different geographical focus. It says John reports far more of Jesus' ministry in the south, in Judea and Samaria, than in Galilee, while the focus on the synoptists is the opposite. There are also differences in the style and focus of Jesus' teaching that is reported. Okay, the style and focus, as Powell says. Whereas Jesus is noted for short, pithy sayings in the other Gospels, the Johannine Jesus delivers long philosophical discourses. Furthermore, where the Synoptic Gospels summarize the content of Jesus' proclamation as the good news of the kingdom of God, in John, Jesus talks mostly about himself, not in a bad way, but he's revealing who he is more. Okay, about himself. He talks about his identity as the one who comes to reveal the Father, and about what it means for people to believe in him, love him, obey him, and abide in him. Carson and Moose say many sayings are at least partially parallel. Right? There are some things that is that the bell? Or am I hearing things? All right, that's good. It's part of being old. But there are some common areas. You see, there are things here, significant points of contact between John and the Synoptics. Right? These include John the Baptist's testimony of the Spirit's anointing of Jesus, the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus walking on water. So there are points of contact, and Carson and Moose say, and beyond those explicit points of contact, he says they say many sayings are at least partially parallel. So not only do you have those few explicit similarities between John and the Synoptics, you have sayings that are at least partially parallel, though not decisively attesting literary dependence. More significant yet are the subtle parallels. Both John and the Synoptists describe a Jesus given to colorful metaphors and proverbs. You see, it's the same guy, right? It's the same guy. Proverbs, many drawn from the world of nature. You see that. They say all four Gospels depict Jesus with a unique sense of sonship to his heavenly Father. All of them note the distinctive authority Jesus displays in his teaching. All of them show Jesus referring to himself as the Son of Man, with no one else using that title to refer to him or to anyone else. Okay? So you have these distinctives, the Synoptics, you have these distinctives of John, but you have some points of contact and overlap. And in addition, there are places where John, he seems to presuppose knowledge of the gospel stories. John's was that the bell? Yeah. If it's not, it's going to be in a second. All right, I just see people coming in, so I'm thinking, okay, I'm talking over time. There are places where he presupposes knowledge of the stories from the Synoptics. Okay? So you see that he's writing late, and he understands. He's aware of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and how the church has absorbed these stories and knows them. That's part of why he doesn't repeat them. He's doing something else. As we'll get to next week, he's doing what Clement of Alexandria says. He's not trying to repeat all these things. He's writing a spiritual gospel. Clement of Alexandria, late 2nd century. That's early. He says he's writing a spiritual gospel. So in other words, he's like lifting the curtain. He's telling from God's side. That's part of its power. That's what I say. You have this amazing revelation of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. And so that's it. It's like going behind the curtain. And it's just awesome. Awesome. And I just hope I could do it any kind of justice. But thanks for coming.